By the way, since Dell surprisingly introduced some levity into all this, I'll also mention that if you would like to see mugshots of Dell and Helene, they're online at the Mississippi, I forget the name.
Sovereignty Commission.
If you just put Freedom Rides in a search engine, you can come up with those mugshots. And actually, there's a couple of very nice mugshots of Helene in the magazine, front end profile.
Thank you, Val. Hello? Okay. First, I want to thank Dell for her introduction and the historical summary, which I have to say is the best thing I've heard and best thing I would have read, because in looking at the literature and reviewing it for this talk, either everything was so broad and in detail or so skimpy that it didn't tell you anything. And that is really an excellent summary, and also an entertaining talk, and pithy talk. And thank you personally. My talk may not only as pithy, but it may be short. I'm suffering right now from vertigo, and I just may have to make it very, very short. But I want to get into some things that Dell may not have touched on. The first is some of the underpinnings of the civil rights movement, or the nonviolent movement of civil rights, which I was part of. As you all probably know, most of this is that, it was based on experiences of Gandhi and people who had been involved in nonviolent actions as a result of it, predominantly CORE and Bayard Rustin, who was very heavily involved not only with CORE and the experience and helping people develop nonviolent techniques during the period of the civil rights movement, but he was heavily involved with the students, with the SNCC organization, and helping them form it and helping them develop strategies during the whole civil rights movement. And though he was in New York, there would be monthly meetings of SNCC with SNCC leadership in New York, and there was a confluence, it seems to me, an extraordinary confluence in this country of extraordinary people. Not only was there someone like Bayard Rustin, who was one of the originators of CORE, but Martin Luther King, who was probably the most extraordinary person, and not only in our age, but in our country, that our country has had. And but there were a whole other layer of preachers and community leaders that seemed to have come forth at that period. Reverend Shuttleworth is one that I remember most clearly, which many of you may know of, have heard of, but many of you have not. But there's so many people, and John Lewis, who is also an extraordinary person, who I had also personal contact with him, as well as Bayard Rustin, which I'll discuss a little later. So there was this confluence of, I think, of extraordinary people, and there was the philosophy of Gandhi that and nonviolence that was espoused by Martin Luther King and CORE. And nonviolence is predominantly, aside from the name of not being violent, is the way of using what Gandhi discussed as soul force which is a very difficult thing to define, but Gandhi tried to develop, bring out the good part of a person, the virtues of a person, and that is not only hard to do, but it's hard to do it in times of great stress, and times when people are so emotionally worked up one way or another for good or evil. So the nonviolent movement, what they try to do predominantly was to bring pressure on people to cause change. And the strategies they mainly used were the boycott, the sit-ins, and developing particular interest groups like labor groups or voting rights groups to create the pressure for change. Now, I was when I was living in Buffalo, New York, in my late teens, there was I'm trying to think of words. I'm sorry. As I get older, my memory has gone, and words sometimes escape me. But there was the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, and Bayard Rustin came into town with people of his entourage, that he worked with, and tried to organize people to go down to Washington to demonstrate in favor of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling decision. And that's when I met him, and he asked people to pass out leaflets, and they did organize several buses to go down to Washington and demonstrate. And while I didn't have a chance to go down to the bus to Washington, what I was able to do was to help people get on the bus and do arrangements. And I saw people, mainly black young people, get on the bus, and they didn't even want to be there, you could tell. And their parents were urging them to go. And their heads were bowed, and they were lethargic, and sort of a negative feeling would be coming from them. And they went down, and there was this demonstration, and when they came back, they were totally different people. They were straightened up, their heads were up high, and their bodies were straight, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to see, and it just gave me such a wonderful feeling that I just knew that I wanted to do something to help, to help this situation occur again. And then I moved to, by the way, that was the first demonstration and for many, many years in behalf of black justice in general. And I looked in the papers for some report of it, and I couldn't find anything in the Buffalo papers, but in the New York Times, in a way, way, way back page, there was a little article, like a little paragraph saying that this occurred, and there were about 4,000 people there. Well, Bayard, their head count was close to 10,000 people there, and obviously the media was not interested in reporting this, and that was really an eye-opener for me, and it really had a lot of impact that nobody was interested in this, and that the newspapers were not at all interested in this. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and then the sit-ins occurred, and lo and behold, I was a member of CORE. Well, in the article in Generations, I discussed this. I became a member of CORE. I didn't even know CORE had a chapter there until I had this experience. But when I first moved to Washington, which was 1960, I lived around DuPont Circle. Many of you probably know that area. And there was at that time, and years ago, there was a little candy store there where you got small items like a 7-Eleven. And I walked in that area, and as I walked in, there was a number of people by the counter, and I picked out something, and I walked to the counter, and there was all these people ahead of me, and all of a sudden everybody parted, and all of a sudden I found myself sort of elbowed into or allowed to go to the head of the class, and I was so I couldn't figure out. It was just I sort of puzzled for a second, and all of a sudden I looked around. I realized that everybody else was black and I was white, and it just was so it just I can't explain it except that it like hit me like a force, that it was just wrong. It was just just a terrible thing, and I live near DuPont Circle, and I say that because I was so angry. I called up the newspapers, and I asked to speak to one of the reporters, and I told him about this incident. I said, "How can this happen?" and so on and so forth. And he just was really sort of nasty. And then he said, "Well, you ought to join CORE or something like that." And I said, "Oh, is there a chapter?" And I did. But at least he told me that. And I joined CORE, and I don't know if you remember that period, but if you remember the man who was there, who was the chair of CORE, but his name was Julius Hobson, and he then became very active afterwards in Washington D.C. politics, and so has his son. Julius was also an extraordinary man. He was very well read and very articulate, and which I am not. But we had some not only good programs, but the minute that the sit-ins occurred, which was not long after I came to Washington, they developed an action to picket one of the local People's Pharmacy in support of the sit-ins. And it was also a place that was, in D.C., it was not segregated, but in Northern Virginia it was segregated, the People's Pharmacy, in terms of the eating, sitting down to eat when pharmacies had soda fountains and things like that. So we started in Washington, D.C., and there was a picket line, and then several people from Howard University came down to join us, and they were encouraged to come by a young man, Tom Kahn, who was at Howard, a young white man who was at that time very knowledgeable about CORE. He was a very close friend of Bayard Rustin. So Tom also was an extraordinary young man who later, after graduation from Howard, became an assistant to George Meany at the AFL-CIO. And he brought with him Henry Thomas, who a lot of people knew have heard about from the Freedom Rides that Del mentioned, who had just come up from the South. And when I was introduced initially to Hank Thomas, he was like 17 or 18 years old, I think 18 years old. I had been in DC 2 weeks, and when he, from Florida, when he came to shake my hand, when I was introduced to him, his hand actually shook. He just had no experience of even meeting white people.